I am currently sick today while I'm filming these videos since I usually film them on Monday, rather than Thursday, and I just make sure they get put out on Thursday, but I still wanted to make sure that I got my video done. So today we're going to be talking about terminology in the writing/editing world. Now, a lot of writers know what most of these terms mean if they are at all advanced or working on their craft within the writing realm. But if you're working by yourself or haven't seen a professional editor yet, or if your editor just hasn't used these terms, if they're not using these terms, they're either trying to make sure that they're speaking in terms you can understand, or they may not know what they're talking about. Anyway, that's debatable. But point being, these are terms that writers and editors commonly use. This is just a terminology video, so if you're not really interested, that's okay. But this can be beneficial for some people, especially if you're just starting out with the editing / publishing / getting into the writing community process. Alright, let's start. First one we're going to talk about is hang a lantern on it. Now, this is a terminology term used by a lot of screenwriters and writers in general. I first heard the term coined, I don't know if this is the original, I'm assuming this is not the original place where it was found, because I think they quoted someone else, but I don't remember who they quoted. I originally first heard it on a podcast by Brandon Sanderson, called Writing Excuses. Hanging a lantern on it is basically when you are acknowledging something that is silly or ridiculous, or that seems unusual, and you're just acknowledging that it's silly and ridiculous, and that actually helps the reader feel better about it. It's funny because you'd think, oh shoot, if I just don't mention that she's running in heels, maybe the reader won't mention it. No, the reader's going to notice, and they're going to be bothered by it. But if you hang a lantern on it, and you mention something about it, and have some other character be like, why are you being such an idiot? Just take the heels off. And she's like, no, I don't want to. And plus I run fabulously in these heels, or something like that. That is actually going to help the reader be like, okay, cool. We acknowledged the fact that it was stupid. Now I can move on. Stupid or silly, or that we don't know what is going on, or that this could solve the problem easily, but we're not for whatever reason. All those are great examples of times to hang a lantern on it. With hanging a lantern on it, generally it's something small. Don't, make a huge deal out of it. That's no longer hanging a lantern on it. That's, putting a spotlight on it. And that's when it causes problems. But if you just hang a lantern on it, have a little interaction with the dialogue, like I said with the heels thing, that's a great example of, just throwing in a little something to acknowledge that it's ridiculous, and then move on. Your readers will actually feel more comfortable with it when you hang a lantern on it. So that's what it means to hang a lantern on it, is just to acknowledge something that is frivolous or ridiculous about the writing. Alright, next is show, don't tell. With showing rather than telling, I actually like to do this slightly differently. There's showing, telling, and tactful telling. My friend Jade coined the term tactful telling, so I cannot take, credit for that. So with an example of telling is, if I were to describe myself, I would say, she has blonde hair, she has hazel eyes, she is looking a little sick today. That's very bland, very bleh. We're not really interested, we're not really invested, it just kind of sounds like a textbook stating facts. Tactful telling would be like, she felt incredibly groggy, but as she continued to twist her blonde hair anxiously, she stared at the screen and gave her best smile and sparkling hazel eyes. Now, I don't actually think that about myself, but it was what came to my brain. That would be a tactful telling. The reason why is because you're telling the audience that they feel sick, rather than showing that they feel sick. However, the rest of it is all showing. With tactful telling, it's a blend of telling and showing that makes it feel more acceptable. makes it so that you can slip things in a little bit easier. I would say try to go 50-50 with it. Maybe 60-40, but only if you want to feel like an Austinian Regency feel to it. Most of the time, people prefer showing. That's why the phrase show, don't tell is so popular. With showing, the good example would be, she twisted her blonde hair anxiously and smiled at the camera. Her hazel eyes a little dulled and weary, her shoulders sagging a little bit as she sniffled. You'd never once said that the character was sick. You never once said that they were blonde, said that they had hazel eyes. You implied it all through action, through seeing what is happening. It is a more cinematography-based kind of thing, where you're seeing the character doing all these things, rather than stating what the character is doing and feeling. That is showing versus telling. And the reason why, again, show, don't tell is because telling feels a little bit like a textbook, and tactful telling is difficult to get the right range on. Alright, the next term that we're going to go over is info dumping. Now, this is when you are telling so much to the point where the reader is overwhelmed and there's just a tsunami of information flowing at their face. Telling. Generally want to avoid this. Generally causes the readers to, as I said, feel like they're drowning in information. Not a positive experience. Next thing is Deus Ex Machina. This is when you have an ending that you didn't fully plan out or foreshadow, and so when you get to that ending, it feels cheap. It feels like, crap, that did not turn out the way I thought it is. It's like when you watch a B-rated movie, and you're watching along and you're like, oh, everything's okay, it's kind of cute. Whoa, it's getting worse. It got worse. Whoa, and how did that end happily? It should not have. Like, that's Deus Ex Machina. That's part of the reason why B-rated movies are B-rated movies, is because Deus Ex Machina is incredibly popular amongst them. Not all of them, but I would say 95% of them use Deus Ex Machina, and that is why they are unpopular. If you want to look at ways to fix this, I have a whole video on it. Next is pacing. Now, what we're talking about when we're talking about pacing is making sure that it's not too fast or too slow. You want to make sure that you're not skipping whole years in the middle of your novel just to get to your next point. That's way pushing it. You should just slow down. You also want to make sure that you're not going too slow to the point where you're like, I'm good, how are you? I'm good, how are you? Oh, I know, it's great today. That's fluff. Unnecessary. Too slow. Skip to the meat of the conversation. So that's pacing. Making sure that it's not too slow or too fast. Next is in late, out early rule. Now, the in late rule, out early rule, is a screenwriting term that a lot of writers have come to use. It's where you come into the story late, so you don't come right when the story starts, but rather just after the story starts, so that way it's a little bit more interesting, a little bit more drama, intrigue, action. And then you leave early. You leave when not everything is resolved, but almost everything is resolved. That way it feels more satisfying to the reader because it leaves some things to the imagination. Alright, next term is soft, sci-fi, fantasy, etc. versus hard, sci-fi, fantasy, etc. So soft fantasy is when fantasy is kind of implied, it's kind of gentle, it guides the plot a little bit, but it's not the main focus of the plot. It's just there as a nice accoutrement. And same thing with soft sci-fi, where it's like, oh, this is important, but it's not, we're not going to go hard science into this, it's just kind of generally sciencey. Whereas with hard science fiction, you explain the heck out of everything. You make sure that everything follows scientific rules. You make sure that it all pans out perfectly. Same thing with hard fantasy. You make sure that the magic is not only involved, but the magic system is super integrated to the point where there are levels upon levels of rules and riddles to follow that you all have to keep track of and that your readers have to keep track of too. So that's soft fantasy versus sci-fi versus hard fantasy and sci-fi. Alright, next thing I want to talk about is spice levels. Now, a lot of people are like, it's a 1 out of 5 or whatever. Everyone defines those things differently. In publishing, there are actual official terms for it. I'm going to go over the official terms. Now, there are some gray areas, but these are the official terms. There's sweet romance. A sweet romance means that they might kiss a little. They might not even kiss. They might just flirt. And that is going to be a sweet romance. generally this is more Regency. Think Regency era, where they're just like, oh, you're so cute, but they never actually kiss. That's a lot of Regency, sweet romance. Now, not all of it, but a lot of it is sweet romance. The next is steamy. Now, this is when you start getting into more makeout sessions, more passionate kisses, things like that, but you don't actually have anything happen, if you know what I mean. And then the last one that I'm going to talk about today, because I'm not comfortable talking about the fourth one, is closed door. That's when things happen, but we only see the lead up, and then it fades to black. Kind of like you would see on a movie that's PG-13, where you know what's happening, but you don't show what's happening. Those are the determined spice levels. That's according to publishing. Those are things you might want to know if you have romance heavily involved in your book, so that way you can tell your publishers when you're querying. Alright, next is blurb versus summary. A blurb is the back of your book that gives you a little intrigue, a little interest, but it doesn't tell you everything that's going to happen. A summary is where you say X, Y, Z is going to happen for the benefit of the person you're sending your book to. And generally, they will want a blurb that reads a little bit more like a summary, and they have more detail. Whereas with a blurb, you want the least amount of detail possible. You want intrigue. You want, like, oh my gosh, there's magic? What? Her parents are kidnapped? What? You want them to constantly be asking what and questions, whereas with a summary, you want them to be like, oh, that sounds really intriguing, rather than being, like, so confused that they want to read more. And confused is the wrong word, but intrigued that they want to read more. One is more like a light intrigue, where it's like, this could be good, because they know enough detail to have less questions, whereas the other one is like, I have so many questions, I must read it. I'm not sure if that makes full sense. I'm a little tired today, if you can't tell. That's the reason I stayed home. Sorry. And still a little sniffly and coffee. Next is maid and butler dialogue. Maid and butler dialogue is where you have them saying things that they already know for some reason. That doesn't make sense. Like, for example, if someone's a big know-it-all and they're like, as you know, we need to have dinner served at 6, and they're like, yes, I know, Mom, then it's like showing that the mom's controlling. Whereas maid and butler dialogue is like, as you know, dinner is being served at 6, and the other person is like, yes, of course, I know dinner is served at 6. They're like just repeating it for the benefit of the audience, and it's actually really annoying because it feels like you're smacking the audience over the head with this information. It's a cheap way of telling rather than showing. If you want to show something, then just have them scurrying around quickly trying to get dinner ready before 6 because something's going to happen. You know, that's going to be far more interesting than just having them repeat, this is what's going to be happening for the benefit of the reader. It's actually quite kind of obnoxious. That's why it's called maid and butler dialogue, because it was done a lot in movies before they realized that this was not a good way to portray information. And they typically did it with maid and butlers. Don't know why, they did. Next is POV. This is point of view. So if you see this written a lot on your thing, it might be because of the fact that you have multiple points of view, and so if your editor is noticing that there's a problem with point of view slip, then they might say POV slip here. You go into so-and-so's POV instead of, and you can figure out eventually that it's point of view, but I figured that would be a good one to cover. Next one is WIP, or WIP. Work in progress. This is when you have not finished your first draft of a novel. It's a work in progress. You'll see this a lot more if you're on Instagram or TikTok or any sort of social media platform where you're trying to connect with writers. They'll have a lot of, this is my WIP, my work in progress. And so you'll want to look more into that and see what they're writing. Next is passive voice. You might have editors talk a lot about, hey, you're using passive voice here. Passive voice is when you aren't acknowledging whose fault it is. So, for example, the vase was broken by someone. Instead of saying, or even worse, the vase was broken by me. This is passive. The reason why it's passive is because of the fact that you're not really acknowledging or taking full account. If you were to say, I broke the vase, that's active because you're saying, I broke the vase. But if you're saying, the vase was broken by me, it's all past tense, and it's all not. It's all focusing on the verb, broken, and focusing on the was, and focusing on the it did happen, and the last thing you're thinking about is the person who did the action. Should be the other way around. Next is MC, which stands for main character. You might see this a lot if you notice that you're switching between main characters and side characters. Your editor might say the MC is seeming a little confused here. Explain why. Different things like that. Last one is going to be red herring. This is when you have something like a suspect in a murder case that ends up not actually being the real person who did it. Or this ends up being when you think that so-and-so is the villain, but then, psych, they're actually just the sidekick to this greater villain. Those are red herrings. Alright, if you have any other writing terms that you'd like me to define that you've heard of that you're not quite sure about, please feel free to ask in the comments, and thank you so much. Bye.